This week's story is called A Change in Fortune. On the hot evening of September 20th, 1987, 37-year-old Maria Ferreira hosted a lively family gathering at her small home in Goiânia, Brazil. Goiânia was a cosmopolitan city with nearly 1 million people. Gleaming skyscrapers and tropical fruit trees lined the wealthy downtown area. But there were also areas of extreme poverty. Maria and her husband, Davayer, lived in one of these lower-income neighborhoods where they owned and operated a scrapyard on their property. It was hard work, especially in the intense tropical heat. But Maria and Davayer made a great team. Maria liked to joke that even though Davayer was short and stocky, he always had his head in the clouds. Davayer would tease Maria when she took things too seriously, saying that was why she had a gray streak in her long brown hair. But on this night, Maria was totally relaxed. There was plenty of delicious food and drink with people she loved, and they were able to pay for it because they had a little extra money from selling more scrap metal than usual. Maria and Davayer had also acquired a rare good luck charm a few days earlier. They never had much in the way of material possessions, but they tried to find beauty in their everyday life. This time, it was in a trinket Davayer had found. As they passed it around the table, she felt grateful for all the good fortune that had come their way. In the chair next to Maria, Davayer scooped a spoonful of black bean and pork stew onto his plate. He was listening to his brother, who was a bus driver, tell a story. He always had something funny to share from one of his routes. Davayer's other brother, Ivo, was there as well with his wife and their 6-year-old daughter, Lei Ji. The little girl's big brown eyes and joyful laugh filled Maria with love. Lei Ji was the closest thing she had had to a daughter since she didn't have any children of her own. It was the perfect night, and that called for a toast. Once everyone refilled their glasses, Maria raised hers in the air and thanked her family for coming. They all cheered and drank to the future. Later, after everyone left, Davayer went into the garage to finish up some work. As Maria washed coffee cups and put away plates, she could hear thunder in the distance. The next morning, on September 21st, Maria woke to the sound of rain pelting her tin rooftop. Goiânia's rainy season normally ran from October to April, but this year it had started earlier than usual. As Maria climbed out of bed, she noticed that she didn't feel well. Her body was stiff and her stomach felt upset. She wrote off her discomfort to the previous night's festivities and tried to carry on with her day. But as time passed, Maria was starting to feel increasingly sick until finally, after a few hours, she started violently vomiting. Now, the pain in Maria's stomach was so bad that she decided she needed to see a doctor right away. She slowly got dressed and walked out to tell Davayer. Maria found him working in the scrapyard. It was cluttered with old refrigerators, large pieces of sheet metal, and disassembled machines. Davayer offered to take her, but she said she didn't want to distract him from his work, so she told him she could get there on her own. Maria took a bus to a nearby hospital and was able to see a doctor right away. After the doctor examined her, he said everything was fine. She must be having an allergic reaction to something she ate. Maria was relieved it wasn't something more serious. She found it hard to believe she could be this sick from food she was used to eating, but the doctor reassured her and said to go home and rest and she would feel better soon. But that evening, Maria still felt just as sick. She called her mom, who lived in a neighboring town, and asked her to come stay for a few days. Maria's mother took a bus there right away, and once she got there, she did her best to nurse her daughter back to health, feeding her broth and herbs, but whatever Maria had caught, it just wasn't going away. Even worse, Maria's mother soon started to feel sick too, with the same symptoms of fever and upset stomach that Maria had. So 2 days later, Maria's mom had to return back to her home to rest and recuperate as well. Maria was confused. If she was suffering from a food allergy like the doctor thought, why would her mom have gotten sick too? So now she thought maybe she'd come down with the flu and her mother had just caught it from her. So when her brother-in-law, Ivo, stopped by the house on September 24th, Maria tried to keep her distance from him. She'd been sick for 4 days and didn't want to risk passing anything on. Ivo didn't stay long at Maria and Davayer's house, and soon he got back to his own home right in time for lunch. His wife had put out some egg sandwiches, and after Ivo and his wife had sat down to eat, they called in their daughter, Leiji, to come join them. But Leiji was having too much fun playing with her dolls, her glitter, and her coloring books. Finally, Leiji did abandon her toys and took her seat at the table with her parents. But just 10 minutes after eating, Leiji threw up. Then, later that afternoon, Ivo and his wife got sick too. At first, they thought it was the eggs they had for lunch, but Ivo soon realized this wasn't just a case of food poisoning. It seemed like almost everyone who had gone to the Ferreira household recently was getting sick. And by now, that included De Valliere, who was feeling nauseous, as well as his mother, who had come by to visit. The list grew to include 2 of De Valliere's brothers and a handful of their children. The sickness had even spread to several of the neighbors who had visited with Maria and De Valliere. 2 of De Valliere's scrapyard employees had also become ill, all in the span of a week. When Maria found out about the growing number of people who were getting sick, she was horrified, and she became even more afraid when she noticed something else very disturbing. There were these red lesions that were showing up on her skin that were painful to the touch. By September 27th, nearly a week after first getting sick, Maria's stomach pain was unbearable. As she lay curled up in bed listening to the rain falling outside, she thought back to that last night she felt healthy. It was the same night she had hosted the big family gathering. Maria tried to remember everything she had done that night. Then she realized something. There was only one thing that everyone who had gotten sick over the last 10 days had in common. Maria could barely move, but she knew what she had to do next. If she didn't get to the bottom of this mystery, her whole family could be in serious danger. And so, on the next morning, she willed herself out of bed and slowly managed to get dressed. Then she gathered the evidence she needed in a cloth sack. Maria knew where she wanted to take it, and it wasn't to the hospital where she'd been before. She was going somewhere that had the authority to help her. The only issue was, she needed someone to go with her. She was too exhausted to make the trip on her own. De Valliere wasn't feeling well enough to go with her, so she asked another scrapyard employee to accompany her. Maria let the young man carry the bag she'd packed. She was so weak she could barely keep moving. Just down the street, they boarded a crowded bus, and about a half hour later, they got off near an office called the Vigilancia Sanitaria. This was a public health agency that regulated pharmaceuticals, food products, and sanitary conditions. It was basically the Brazilian equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. Maria thought that if anybody could figure out what was making her and her family so sick, it would be someone at this agency. She and her companion entered the plain brick building through a courtyard and were taken into the office belonging to the agency's director. The young man helping Maria dropped the bag he was carrying on the official's desk. Then Maria wiped her flushed face with a handkerchief and explained what it was. She said the contents of the bag were killing her family. The official just stared at her. He looked inside the bag and seemed confused. The items inside didn't look particularly dangerous. He said what really concerned him was Maria. Maria knew she was sweating and visibly shaking, and she noticed his expression as he looked at all the lesions and burn-like marks on her arms. The official told her that right now, she just needed to see a doctor, but he did promise he would take a closer look at what was in the bag. And, just to be safe, the official put the bag on a chair in the building's courtyard, then made sure Maria knew how to get to the nearest health clinic. Maria was skeptical. The last time she'd seen a doctor, he'd given her the wrong diagnosis, but she didn't know what else to do, so she and her companion left the agency and headed to the bus stop. Maria insisted that her companion return to the scrapyard and get back to work. Unsure and scared about what she would find out, Maria boarded the bus alone. A short time later, a doctor at this clinic carefully examined Maria and then gave her a new diagnosis. He said she was right. She was not experiencing an allergic reaction or food poisoning. What she had was a tropical disease, and her family and friends who were sick probably had it too. He explained that the unusually heavy rains had been spawning mosquitoes and a host of other bugs that carried infectious diseases. A virus like dengue or Zika would explain her symptoms, including the burn-like lesions she'd developed. The doctor assured Maria that this was all very manageable and that everything would be okay. Then he arranged to have her transported to the Tropical Diseases Hospital for specialized treatment. Maria's unease lightened, and she even managed a weak smile. She finally had a real explanation for what was happening to her and her family. It was a relief to think that the bag she had left at the health agency didn't actually have anything to do with a tropical virus. Less than an hour later, Maria arrived at the Tropical Diseases Hospital. As a doctor took her vitals, she asked if he knew what type of virus was going around. But instead of answering her question, the doctor gently took her arm and began closely examining her skin lesions. Then he called one of the nurses over to look at them. The nurse said she'd seen some other patients with similar burns in the last few days. Suddenly, the doctor's face turned serious, which made Maria extremely nervous. He continued to examine her, and then he stepped back. He explained that the doctor at the previous health clinic had been wrong too. Maria's symptoms did not line up with any kind of tropical disease he'd ever treated. In fact, this doctor was afraid Maria's symptoms were connected to another sickness entirely, and if he was even partially correct, they would need to move quickly. This could be a dangerous situation. The doctor asked her detailed questions about the past several days, and Maria shared everything she could remember. She could see the alarm spread across his face the more they talked. Maria felt a terrible wave of panic and nausea start to wash over her, and then she felt like she needed to tell him about the bag. So she explained that she had brought this bag and left it at the public health agency in hopes that they would analyze it. As soon as she said this, the doctor quickly excused himself and ran as fast as he could to the phone. He called a physician at the state's Department of the Environment. He tried to hide the rising panic in his voice as he explained the urgency of the situation and that action needed to be taken immediately. Both doctors agreed that the bag Maria brought to the public health office had to be examined as soon as possible to prevent the spread of what was making everyone sick. The doctor at the Department of the Environment knew a specialist named Walter Ferreira. Dr. Ferreira, who had no relation to Maria and her family, would be able to properly analyze the bag's contents. But because it was late in the evening, they wouldn't be able to contact him until the next day. Early the next morning, Dr. Ferreira was getting dressed when his phone rang. It was the doctor from the Department of the Environment calling. Dr. Ferreira paced anxiously as he learned what was going on. There was a huge crisis taking place in Goiânia, and he needed to act quickly. He scribbled down the address to the public health office where the bag was, and then ran out the door and went to a nearby office to grab some equipment. He hoped his colleague at the Department of the Environment was wrong about everything, because if he wasn't, that meant thousands of lives were now in danger. About an hour later, Dr. Ferreira arrived at the public health office. Before he entered the courtyard, he pulled a device out of a case. The device would reveal if their terrible suspicions were correct. He carefully switched on the piece of equipment, but right away it seemed like the device was malfunctioning. And no matter how much Dr. Ferreira struggled to adjust the equipment, it just wouldn't work. The readings were just so impossible that he assumed it had to be broken. Dr. Ferreira was frustrated. Now he would need to go back to his office and swap out this broken device for a new one. So he let the receptionist know he'd be back as soon as possible. Almost 2 hours later, Dr. Ferreira returned with a replacement piece of equipment. When he turned that one on, the exact same thing happened. The readings were impossible. He tried turning it on and off several times, but he just kept getting these totally incredible readings. After a few minutes, Dr. Ferreira was horrified to realize that he had been wrong. Both of these devices had been working perfectly fine, and that meant the reality of this situation was much, much worse. If this situation didn't get handled, the whole city of Goiânia could have a catastrophic health crisis on their hands, and maybe all of Brazil could have a health crisis on their hands. So Dr. Ferreira knew he needed to get to that bag. Dr. Ferreira ran inside the building and was met by the facility's director. Ferreira asked where this bag was, but the director explained that he had become concerned about the bag's contents, so he had called in the fire brigade for assistance. In fact, the firefighters were already there and were about to take the bag from the building's courtyard. Their plan was to dispose of it in a nearby stream. Dr. Ferreira ran into the courtyard and saw a group of firefighters surrounding the bag. He yelled for them to stop, and that if they threw it in the water, it would trigger a horrific disaster. He warned them not to touch it and insisted that everyone just evacuate the building. Once Dr. Ferreira was able to explain what was happening, the firefighters realized just how serious this situation was, and they helped him clear the area. But the day was far from over. Dr. Ferreira knew he needed to track down Maria and speak to her about the contents of this bag. He located her at a hospital, but her condition had now worsened to the point where she was just too weak to even talk. But she was able to instruct Dr. Ferreira to just go to her family's junkyard, where he would find her husband, and he could answer any questions the doctor might have. It was noon by the time Dr. Ferreira and his colleague got to Maria and Devaillere's scrapyard. When they arrived, they saw Devaillere working next to his garage. Dr. Ferreira introduced himself and tried to shake Devaillere's hand, but Devaillere politely refused, and then he showed them the inside of his hand, and there was this huge open sore on his palm. Dr. Ferreira looked at it and then immediately shot a look of worry at his colleague. The doctor knew this type of wound on Devaillere's hand could only be caused by one thing, and it was the thing that Dr. Ferreira feared the most. Devaillere told them that this whole situation began 11 days earlier on September 18th. That morning, around 10 a.m., a young man had stopped by their scrapyard and told him about some scrap metal he'd found and wanted to sell. He had never seen anything like it and thought it was valuable. Devaillere said he was interested and told the young man to bring it over. Later that day, the young man returned, now hauling something in a wheelbarrow. Inside this wheelbarrow were the disassembled pieces of a large metal contraption. There was also a small capsule shaped like an oversized thermos. Devaillere thought both items were made of stainless steel, which would earn him a nice profit. But after Devaillere examined the capsule more closely, he became even more excited. It was lined with lead, which was an even more valuable metal. Devaillere paid the man the equivalent of about $30 and brought his new purchases into his garage. He left them there before heading inside to eat dinner. Once he was done eating, he headed back to the garage to start extracting the lead. But when Devaillere opened back up the garage doors, he was amazed by what he now saw inside. A strange blue glow was now coming from the thermos-shaped capsule. Devaillere was a deeply spiritual man and thought he might have encountered something supernatural. He grabbed the metal capsule and called Maria into the garage so she could see it too. When Maria saw its unusual glow, she was just as mystified as Devaillere. They took a closer look and saw that the blue light was coming through a small window on the side of the capsule. The window looked like it had already been punctured with a screwdriver, probably by the young man who had just sold it to Devaillere. Maria thought there could be a priceless gemstone hidden inside, but Devaillere was sure that it was actually a holy relic that would bring blessings and good fortune to the family. Devaillere was determined to continue examining this object. So he poked around the small opening with a screwdriver and removed what appeared to be several small pellets of a glittery bluish powder. The pellets were part of a slightly bigger pile that still sat deep inside the capsule. For all Devaillere knew, this luminous powder could be worth thousands of dollars. It could change their lives in a way they'd never imagined. As Devaillere told the doctors of this discovery, he remembered how special he felt handling the powder, and he wanted his whole family to experience it. This was the good luck charm they shared at their big family dinner. Over the next few days, Devaillere shared his discovery with more family and friends and neighbors, and each time someone came over, he brought out the special glitter. Small groups of people gathered around the capsule, and peered through the broken window to admire the glowing powder inside. Many touched the small pellets Devayer had extracted. Seeing how excited everyone was about the powder made Devayer determined to extract the rest of it from the capsule. So a friend came over and, using a screwdriver, helped him remove fragments from behind the glass window. Eventually, they did get it all out. The entire pile was small enough to fit in the palm of Devayer's hand. Once all the powder had been extracted, Devayer gave the capsule to 2 of his employees and asked them to melt it down for metal and sell it to a nearby scrapyard. Then he brought some of the powder to Maria, who in turn dusted it all over her pajamas and bed sheets. Devayer gave a grain-sized fragment to his brother, the bus driver, who rubbed it on his hands before heading into work. And on his shift as a bus driver, he came into contact with dozens of people. Another one of Devayer's brothers dipped his finger in the blue powder and traced a cross on his abdomen for divine protection. Maria's mother handled some of the powder while she was taking care of Maria, and then she too became ill. Around that same time, Devayer had given some fragments to his brother Ivo, and later, Ivo's daughter, Leiji, played with the glittery crystals and rubbed them all over her hands and arms. And then immediately after doing that, she had eaten her egg sandwich and become ill right away. Devayer also shared his good luck charm with several neighbors who began having symptoms as well. After Maria had spent days wondering what might have caused so many people to get sick so quickly, she finally realized they all had one thing in common. They all had come in contact with this mysterious blue powder. So, on the morning of September 28th, 10 days after buying this capsule, Maria told Devayer she was taking what was left of the powder and the capsule to the local health agency to be analyzed. She placed these remnants in a large cloth bag, then she headed out with one of Devayer's employees to retrieve the parts of the capsule that had been sold to the other scrapyards. She managed to collect most of it. Those were also placed in the bag that Maria brought to the public health office. The story confirmed Dr. Ferreira's worst fears. He asked Devayer about the young man who first sold him the capsule and where he'd gotten it. Devayer said he wasn't sure, but he thought it might have come from some sort of abandoned facility that was located nearby. Dr. Ferreira turned to his colleague and saw that the other doctor's face had now gone white, because he knew exactly where that capsule had come from. It was a clinic that had closed 2 years earlier, a cancer treatment clinic. The capsule had come from a radiation therapy machine, and the magical blue powder that was inside wasn't from a precious gemstone. The powder was a highly radioactive material called cesium-137. When properly contained in the capsule, the powder's destructive capabilities could be used for focused cancer treatments, but without that protective shell, the powder became one of the most lethal substances on Earth. Maria and the others were not suffering from a tropical disease or any of the other things that doctors first thought. They were experiencing massive radiation poisoning, and the lesions they had developed were radiation burns. The handful of powder that Devayer found was enough to make more than 200 people extremely ill and place thousands more in danger. Dr. Ferreira knew all this because he was a medical physicist, and the tool he had tried to use outside of the public health agency was a radiation detector. He thought both detectors were broken because they were making so much noise and their readings were so high they were literally off the charts. But the detectors were correct. They were reading such high levels of radiation in the vicinity of where this bag was that contained the powder that the federal government would have to get involved. And now that Dr. Ferreira had confirmed just how serious the situation had become, he contacted Brazil's Nuclear Energy Commission. Within a matter of hours, they started testing thousands of Goiânia's residents for radiation poisoning in the city's sports stadium. On the morning of September 30th, 13 days after Devayer bought the capsule, workers in hazmat suits arrived in the courtyard of the health agency to properly dispose of the bag that contained the radioactive material. The abandoned cancer clinic, where the blue powder was first discovered, was demolished as well. On October 23rd, Maria Ferreira finally died. Her niece, Leiji, also died on the same day. They were each buried in special fiberglass, lead-lined coffins to prevent radiation from leaking out. By the end of the month, de Vallere's 2 young employees also died as a result of the exposure they had received when they melted down the capsule for de Valleire. While Maria's husband, de Valleire, survived the tragedy, he never mentally recovered. De Valleire died in 1994, 7 years later. Thankfully, no one else died from the radiation exposure, but many others sustained amputations, severe burn scars, and lifelong medical conditions. The Goiânia incident remains one of history's deadliest disasters involving medical radiation. On the night of Saturday, November 13th, 2004, in a tiny city called Craig, Alaska, all the people who were attending the Chamber of Commerce banquet suddenly stood up and broke into applause for 48-year-old Lori Waterman. Lori was sitting at a table in the back of the room. She was tall with short brown hair and her skin was very pale, but at this moment, her cheeks were flushed red with embarrassment as she looked around at all the familiar faces smiling at her. Lori knew almost all of the 1,300 residents in Craig, Alaska from her many years as a community volunteer and special education teacher's aide. And Lori definitely knew everyone at this banquet because she had helped her friend organize it. From the podium, Lori's friend told the room that she couldn't have put on this event without Lori, and that Lori was really the one person in Craig, Alaska that people could always count on if they needed help with anything. Lori stood up and smiled sheepishly and waved to all the people in the room as they continued to cheer for her. Lori wished her husband, Doc Waterman, had been there to see this, but unfortunately, he was hundreds of miles away in Juneau, Alaska, on a business trip for the weekend. Lori's husband was a prominent real estate agent. Still, Lori had the feeling that this was her lucky night. She had won the raffle for a fleece jacket earlier in the evening, and by the time the dinner wrapped up at about 10 p.m., so many people had thanked her personally for all her help through the years that she truly felt appreciated and celebrated. At the conclusion of the banquet, Lori hugged her friend who she had planned this banquet with, and then said she would see her again the next day after church. Both Lori and her friend were on a committee that helped raise money for an international Catholic event for young people. The friends hugged one more time, said goodbye, and then Lori turned around and headed for the parking lot. Lori drove her purple minivan to her peach-colored house at 604 Ocean View Drive. With its spectacular view of the bay, the 3-bedroom, 3-bath house was one of the nicest in town. But to Lori, the house always felt a bit empty whenever Doc was away. And also, this night, Lori and Doc's 16-year-old daughter, Rochelle, was also out of town at a volleyball tournament in Anchorage. So tonight, Lori was going to be all alone. As Lori headed upstairs for the night, she walked past Rochelle's bedroom and thought about the fight they had had right before Rochelle left town with her volleyball team. Lori had seen the all-black outfits that her daughter was packing for this trip and asked Rochelle why she couldn't bring something a bit more cheery. Lori was not a big fan of the goth stylings that Rochelle had adopted over the last year, but Lori's daughter just rolled her eyes at her mother as soon as she began talking about her outfit. Then Lori also told her daughter that she didn't really like the shaggy 20-something-year-old guys that Rochelle had been hanging out with recently. They seemed polite, but Lori felt like they were just too old for Rochelle, and they also didn't seem ambitious enough for an honor roll student like Lori's daughter. One of them even lived in his mother's basement. Rochelle had cursed at her mother when Lori had said some things about her friends, and at that point, Lori was furious and she just couldn't contain herself. Lori began complaining about all the time Rochelle spent on her computer, specifically all the time that Rochelle spent publicly embarrassing her family on the computer. Rochelle was a blogger whose blog, called My Crappy Life, often harshly criticized the people in her life and referred to their town not as Craig, Alaska, but as Hell, Alaska. This online journal really upset Lori because she wanted to give her daughter the best life possible. But the blog's title, My Crappy Life, really made Lori feel like she had failed as a mother. But perhaps what bothered Lori most about the blog was that Rochelle had made their mother-daughter friction public.
Once, Rochelle had written about coming home from school and proudly telling her mother that she had scored a 92 on a Spanish test, but she had said her mom, Lori, ignored her grade completely and just told her she should go to fat camp. But that wasn't even true. Lori had told her daughter that maybe she should eat healthier, but never once mentioned fat camp. This fight they got into had ended with Rochelle theatrically throwing even more black clothing into her suitcase and Lori storming out of her room. Now, thinking back over what happened, Lori regretted the things she said and how blunt she had been. She still disliked the gloomy clothes, the two old friends, and the rude-seeming blog, but she really wished she had not offended her daughter. So, while Rochelle was off at her volleyball tournament, Lori had written her a letter, expressing how sorry she was that they had been arguing lately. Lori said that she hoped they could get back to the way things used to be when they were closer. Lori had left this note on Rochelle's nightstand, knowing she would find it when she came home, and Lori hoped it would help reset their relationship. Lori walked down the hall into her and Doc's bedroom and changed into her nightgown. She brushed her teeth and got ready for bed. As she took off her wedding band and engagement ring, she thought about Doc, wishing her husband did not have to travel so much for work. Doc was a dozen years older than Lori, and not far from retirement age. Lori had hoped that he'd start throttling down his workload, but lately it seemed that Doc had been busier than ever. But Lori couldn't help but wonder if maybe there was another reason why Doc was staying away so much. She knew her husband had a wandering eye. People had made innuendos to her about that before. Lori tried not to listen to the gossip. She knew Doc could be a flirt, but she was sure he would never actually cheat on her. Still, on this night, when Lori was already feeling insecure about her relationship with her daughter, the rumors about her husband's supposed affair really nagged at her. Lori slipped into bed around 11 p.m. She grabbed the TV remote from the bedside table and turned on the TV. She didn't mind a little solitude, but she had been on her own for a few days now, and she couldn't wait for her husband and daughter to come home the next day. After a few minutes of TV channel surfing, Lori turned out the lights and drifted off to sleep. At 3:30 p.m. the next day, which was a Sunday, Doc Waterman and his daughter Rochelle drove towards their house. They had been in different cities over the weekend, but their paths had crossed at the airport, and so they headed home together. Like Lori, Doc was a highly respected figure in town. The Vietnam War veteran had his struggles, including the lingering effects of post-traumatic stress, but he'd managed to build a family and a career as the top real estate agent on the whole Prince of Wales Island, which is where Craig, Alaska was, which is one of the biggest islands in the entire United States. Doc steered his car down Ocean View and turned into his driveway. He then opened the garage door to park, and immediately he noticed that his wife's purple minivan was gone. Doc had expected Lori to be home to greet them, but then again, she was always busy, even on a Sunday. Doc figured she must be out running an errand or attending a meeting. And at this point, Doc was actually far more concerned about his daughter, Rochelle, who had sprained her ankle during her volleyball tournament. And so Doc helped his daughter limp into the house and upstairs. Rochelle hobbled into her room and sat down on her bed. She looked over at her nightstand and she saw the letter her mother had written her. She unfolded it, and as she started to read, she began to cry. She hated how much she and her mom had been fighting, and she too wished things were different. Eventually, Rochelle wiped the tears away and put the letter down. Meanwhile, Doc walked into the kitchen to check the messages on the answering machine. He noticed an empty bottle of wine sitting on the counter, which he found very odd, because Lori really was not a drinker and certainly would not be drinking on her own. The answering machine showed 3 messages. Doc pressed play and listened, but all the calls were from him checking in as he made his way home. Doc carried his suitcase up to his and Lori's bedroom on the 3rd floor. Normally, he'd drop his luggage on top of the comforter and start to unpack, but the bed was unmade. Lori always made the bed. That is, if Doc didn't beat her to it. Doc also saw Lori's nightgown thrown haphazardly on the floor. He frowned. His wife of 20 years was a total neat freak. What was going on? Doc suddenly felt flush with concern and stepped into the bathroom to splash water on his face. As he turned on the faucet, he saw Lori's engagement ring and wedding ring sitting next to the sink. Now, Doc was really worried. Lori never went anywhere without those rings. Something very strange was going on. Doc couldn't tell what it was, but he had a sinking feeling that it was bad. Doc knew there were not that many places in their small town where Lori might be, and he couldn't just call her because in 2004, cell phones were still somewhat rare, and Lori didn't have one. So Doc just waited a few hours, hoping Lori would come home on her own. But by 7 p.m., when she hadn't and he hadn't heard from her, Doc felt like he had to act. He didn't want to alarm his daughter, but he told Rochelle that they needed to get in the car and drive around town and look for her mother. Doc and Rochelle drove to the building where the Chamber of Commerce banquet had been held the night before, thinking maybe they'd see Lori's purple minivan parked outside while she helped to clean up inside. But when they got there, her minivan, which anyone could spot a mile away, was nowhere to be found. Next, the father and daughter went to the church, but they didn't see Lori's van there either. Doc did see Lori's friend's car, and he remembered Lori saying she had a committee meeting with her friend that day, but when Doc talked to Lori's friend, the friend said that Lori did not show up to the meeting and had not called to explain why she couldn't be there. So Doc and Rochelle drove to the middle school where Lori worked, but the parking lot was empty. Despite the near-freezing temperatures outside, Doc was sweating. When he and Rochelle had started their search, he was perplexed. Now he was desperate. After driving around for almost 2 hours with no sign of Lori, Doc and Rochelle didn't know what else to do. So at around 9 p.m., they went home, and the normally composed Doc tried to keep from choking up as he called the Craig police. At about the same time Doc was calling the police, Alaska State Trooper Bob Claus drove his SUV down a logging road that cut through a pine-covered mountain nearly 50 miles from Craig. He was one of only 2 troopers who patrolled the entire 145-mile-long island. Claus was out in this area responding to a call he had received from a hunter who had said they had seen a vehicle that had gone off the road and caught on fire. Claus had spotted the plume of smoke in the sky and drove over, and there he found the remains of a minivan on the side of the mountain. It looked like the minivan had careened off the logging road until it struck a fallen log, which prevented it from rolling any further. The van was no longer on fire, but the brush and log beneath it were still smoldering. Claus climbed out of his vehicle and hiked down the slippery wet slope to reach the wreck. When he got there, he saw the tires were melted down to their steel belts. The paint had been scorched off the frame and all the windows were blown out. The fire had burned everything inside the vehicle. Claus looked for something to identify the minivan, but the license plate was a puddle of aluminum, and the vehicle identification number on the driver's side door was melted beyond recognition. Claus had originally come out here believing he was going to find a road accident, that someone had crashed, and that's why this had happened. But when he kind of scanned around the inside of the vehicle, he felt like this was something far worse. If this had been an accidental car crash, Claus would have expected to see the driver's body in the front seat, or at least nearby, and some sign that they had been in the front seat. But the 2 front seats of the car were empty, and there was no sign of a driver. But when Claus looked in the back of the car, he saw something absolutely horrible. There, laying across the back seat, were the charred remains of a human torso. And next to the torso, looking straight at Claus, was a blackened human skull. Claus didn't want to move the vehicle or disturb its contents until help arrived. So he radioed his partner and asked him to stay with the minivan while he called his lieutenant in Craig, Alaska. The lieutenant, in turn, called the Alaska Bureau of Investigation to send help. The Bureau promised to send a team, but cautioned that it would take time for help to arrive. Prince of Wales Island is located 800 miles south of Anchorage, and it has no major airports, and so the trip to the island requires 5 different planes. But finally, a day later, the small aircraft carrying state homicide investigator Randy McFerrin, a state fire investigator, and a crime scene technician touched down at a local airstrip. Right away, the investigators drove out to meet the state troopers on that logging road overlooking the crash site. And when they got there, McFerrin peered down at the wreck, while the fire investigator immediately began taking pictures from the seat next to him. McFerrin, a former Army infantry officer, was an experienced investigator who had led 8 homicide investigations by himself. McFerrin got out of the vehicle and shook hands with Trooper Bob Claus. Claus was relieved to see heavy hitters from Anchorage on the scene. Claus had handled all kinds of cases over his career, but this case seemed far more complex than his two-man station could handle. Claus told McFerrin that they had received a missing person report the night before from the husband of a woman from Craig, a community activist named Lori Waterman. As he said Lori's name, Claus grimaced because he knew Lori really well. His daughter was friendly with her daughter, Rochelle, and like most people in town, Claus liked both Lori and Doc Waterman. It absolutely gutted Claus to think that Lori could be the body in this wreckage, but he would tell the state investigators that that was looking more and more likely. The burned-out vehicle was clearly a minivan, just like the one Lori drove, but the paint had all been scorched off, so it was impossible to tell whether it had once been purple. Claus led McFerrin and the fire investigator down the slope to get a better look at the wreck. The wreck was about 50 yards down the mountain from the gravel road. When they got down to it, McFerrin peered inside at the charred human remains in the back seat. The clothes had burned off completely, and the fire had reduced the lower portion of their legs and the lower portion of the victim's arms to ash, making it truly impossible to tell whether the body was a man or a woman. But right away, the fire investigator could see telltale blistering in the back seat that suggested that an accelerant had caused the fire to burn very hot and fast. In other words, it looked like someone had set this fire on purpose. And adding credibility to that theory, the investigators couldn't find any skid marks on the road, suggesting the driver of this vehicle had never tried to stop, and when people are about to crash, they hit the brakes and they skid, but in this case, there was none of that. McFerrin sighed and looked over at Claus and said, whoever was in this car was murdered. He figured the fire was an attempt to destroy evidence. And whoever had set the fire had very nearly succeeded, because the human remains that crime scene technicians removed from the van weighed just 33 pounds. The rest of that body was just gone. McFerrin ordered the technicians to put all of the human remains into an evidence bag and ship it to Anchorage for an autopsy. Claus arranged for a tow truck to take the wrecked minivan to a nearby garage for further analysis, but as they moved the vehicle, McFerrin found the metal tag from the dashboard that had melted off during the fire, and amazingly, he could still read the minivan's identification number on this tag. And so within minutes, investigators knew exactly who owned this wrecked minivan. Later that night, McFerrin traveled with Claus to the town of Craig to speak with Lori's husband, Doc. Rochelle was home too, along with her friend, Jason Arant. Jason was a large man with flaming red hair, and at 24 years old, he was 8 years older than Rochelle. But the two had become close when Rochelle had worked at a store owned by Jason's best friend the previous summer. Rochelle had called Jason earlier that day because she was worried that something bad had happened to her mother. Rochelle said her mom must have gotten into a drunk driving accident because of the empty wine bottle she and her dad had found in the kitchen. Jason had immediately left his job as a school custodian and gone to Rochelle's school to pick her up. He found her in the principal's office in tears about her missing mother, so Jason had driven her home. McFerrin wanted to speak with the family alone, but Jason said he didn't want to leave Rochelle's side. That is, until Trooper Claus stepped in. Jason had actually come to Claus previously for advice on how to become a Marine, and so he respected the state trooper. So when Claus stepped in and told Jason the family really needed some privacy, Jason listened and he left. Doc invited Claus and McFerrin into the TV room on the first floor of the house. The investigators sat on the couch, but Doc and Rochelle remained standing, bracing themselves for whatever potentially terrible news they were about to learn. After a pause, McFerrin leaned forward, choosing his words very carefully, as he told Doc that they had discovered Lori's burned-out van in the woods 50 miles away, and there was a body in the back seat. McFerrin said that police still needed to make a positive ID of the body, but no one aside from Lori had been reported missing. And so unfortunately, it seemed very likely that the body was Lori. Doc was silent for a moment, and then he sort of stumbled back and fell into a chair. He had seen more than his share of death in Vietnam, and he had never cried, but this was different. He put his face in his hands, and he wept. Trooper Claus turned to Rochelle, who he had known since she was a little girl, and told her how very sorry he was. but Rochelle didn't respond. Instead, she ran upstairs to her bedroom and slammed the door. As she sat on her bed, reeling at the news, her eyes fell on Lori's letter. Rochelle couldn't bear to look at it, so she put the letter inside the nightstand drawer. Meanwhile, downstairs, McFerrin had to make a very difficult request. He needed Doc to obtain his wife's dental x-rays to help identify the body. And so Doc had fumbled through Lori's address book, saying nothing until he found the number of Lori's dentist. And so McFerrin made the call and got Lori's latest x-rays sent to the coroner in Anchorage to see if maybe it was a match. After hanging up with the dentist, McFerrin and Claus asked Doc to walk them through his house and show them everything he had found the day before that seemed sort of strange or out of place and contributed to his worry about his wife. And in fact, in the day since Doc had come home, he had found even more alarming evidence of a crime. Doc took the investigators up to his and Lori's bedroom to show them the tip of a rubber glove and also a 5-inch long fiber from a rope he had found in the sheets of their bed. Then Doc pulled back the comforter on his bed to show them a spot of blood on the sheets. He said at first he assumed this might be menstrual blood, but when he had looked closer, he had seen a few other spots on both sides of the bed. Doc told the investigators that he had no idea who would want to harm his wife. Claus agreed that everyone on the island really seemed to love Lori. At this point, McFerrin very gently told Doc to go ahead and leave the house along with his daughter, because now their home was officially a crime scene and it would soon be cordoned off with yellow tape. With the help of the crime scene technician who had flown out from Anchorage with him, McFerrin started the official search of the house, and almost immediately, he figured out how the assailant had gotten inside. The door that led from the garage into the house had scratches on the lock that indicated to McFerrin that the assailant attempted to force their way in. Meanwhile, Claus began searching Rochelle's room. The walls were adorned with posters of men and women with black hair, black clothes, and black makeup. Claus continued searching through Rochelle's room, searching her dresser, her shelves, and her closet, and then inside of her nightstand, he found that letter that Lori had written to Rochelle. Claus saw that Lori addressed it to, quote, "my dearest daughter," end quote, and he felt a twinge of compassion for this mother trying to reconnect with her daughter. Claus made a mental note to make sure to return this letter to the family. When Claus and McFerrin regrouped in the TV room a little while later, they immediately began reviewing what they had found. Other than a few spots of blood on the bed, there was no sign of a struggle. A couple of details suggested to the investigators that Lori was alive when she left the house. The nightgown, uncharacteristically thrown on the floor, indicated she might have changed in a hurry, and the rope fiber inside the bed sheets suggested the attacker might have tied Lori up at the house rather than killed her. Both investigators agreed that the assailant's break-in attempt looked clumsy and amateurish, but the rope and the rubber glove suggested the killer had planned the crime ahead of time. McFerrin noted that a premeditated crime like this was typically not random. It was usually committed by someone with a personal grudge against the victim. But the scratches on the door where the assailant had entered the house suggested they did not know this family well, because Doc told investigators that most people who knew them would know where he kept the spare key and would have simply unlocked the door. This was perplexing to investigators, so until they could narrow it down, everybody was a suspect. Statistically, the most likely person to have murdered Lori was her own husband. So McFerrin started with Doc. Claus had told McFerrin about the rumors that circulated around town that Doc was having an affair. That was a big red flag. A cheating spouse could have all sorts of reasons to want their partner dead. Doc denied having an affair. He knew what people said about him, and he admitted that he could be flirtatious, plus he was away from home a lot. Small-town rumors really didn't need much more fuel than that. But even if he had been having an affair, it didn't matter. He had a rock-solid alibi. He was over 200 miles away in Juneau at the time of the murder. McFerrin made a mental note to look into the family's finances and phone records to see if Doc could have hired someone to kill Lori while he was away. But he suspected that was a total long shot. If Doc had been involved in planning this crime, McFerrin was pretty sure the killer would not have had such a hard time getting into the house in the first place. Surely, if Doc had hired someone to murder his wife, he would have told the killer where to find the spare key. The following day, which was Tuesday, November 16th, McFerrin finally heard back from the coroner in Anchorage, and as expected, the body was Lori's. The coroner said the fire that had erupted inside of that minivan had reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, the same heat at which bodies are cremated, damaging the remains so badly that a proper autopsy was nearly impossible. But the coroner had been able to match Lori's dental x-rays with the teeth in the skull. However, the coroner was not able to zero in on the time of death or even how Lori had died. McFerrin looked into Doc's bank accounts and found no indication of any money transfers, cash withdrawals, or suspicious gaps in income that could suggest he was trying to hide or transfer funds. And the family's phone records were totally mundane, no unknown numbers or unusual late-night calls. McFerrin eliminated Doc as a primary suspect, and he was eager to talk further with Rochelle, hoping she might shed some light on who might want to hurt her mother. A few hours after the coroner had identified Lori's body, McFerrin picked up Rochelle at her house and drove her to the police station for an official interview. On the short drive, McFerrin tried to make Rochelle feel comfortable, telling her about his own daughter, who was just a few years older than her and in college. Rochelle's eyes were red and puffy, but she seemed to relax and talked about a trip to Germany she and a friend had been planning to take the following year. The pair eventually got to the small police station, and there, McFerrin escorted Rochelle through the small station to a small, windowless interview room. Once they sat down inside, Rochelle said she spoke to her mother just before the Chamber of Commerce dinner on Saturday night. She said her mom seemed excited about the event, and she was looking forward to Rochelle and her father coming home. Rochelle also said that her mom basically got along with everyone. In fact, Rochelle admitted that she, herself, was likely the only person who regularly butted heads with Lori. And even that was nothing major. Most of their arguments were over the way Rochelle dressed or the way she painted her nails black. McFerrin then picked up Lori's letter and read it aloud to Rochelle, and then asked her what could have inspired her mother to write it. Rochelle admitted that her mother did not like some of her friends because they were too old in her mother's eyes, and so they had argued about that. She said her mom especially disliked Jason, her friend who had been at the house when investigators had first visited, but Rochelle said her mom just didn't understand. Rochelle said that her mom was convinced that Rochelle was dating Jason, but Rochelle said she was not. He was just a good friend, nothing more. McFerrin would ask Rochelle several more questions, and he would eventually learn about her blog, which also was a point of contention in Rochelle and Lori's lives. But eventually the interview came to an end, and overall, nothing major really came out of it. However, McFerrin was interested to look more closely at Rochelle's blog. So he drove Rochelle home, and then he and Claus went back to the station, and they sat down at a computer, and they loaded up Rochelle's blog. The blog was pretty harsh. Rochelle complained about her mother a lot, even calling her nasty names like psycho bitch. But both McFerrin and Claus were fathers to girls around Rochelle's age, and they were well aware of the friction that can grow between teenage daughters and their mothers. And so nothing in Rochelle's blog struck either detective as anything more than a typical teenage girl's diary, well, except for the fact that the blog was public. And so they wondered if maybe somebody reading Rochelle's blog had become really fixated with Rochelle's conflicts with her mother. And so the investigators decided to scour Rochelle's electronic communications for any unusual or alarming messages. The next morning at the breakfast table, Claus talked to his daughter, who was good friends with Rochelle. And his daughter said the students were in complete shock that Rochelle's mother had been killed. Murders almost never happened in their tiny town, and certainly not to her friend's parents. But then Claus's daughter told him something interesting. She told him that Rochelle spent a lot of time around 3 people in particular. There was Jason, there was also Jason's friend, Brian Riddell, and there was Rochelle's ex-boyfriend, 16-year-old Ian Lendrum, so 3 guys. And apparently Rochelle and these 3 guys would all play video and fantasy role-playing games together, and Claus's daughter said that sometimes these 3 guys would just show up unannounced when she, Claus's daughter, was trying to hang out with Rochelle alone. Claus's ears pricked up at this. Rochelle had not mentioned that she had an ex-boyfriend. Claus called McFerrin and told him they needed to speak with Ian Lendrum right away. Later that morning, so this was 3.5 days after the murder, McFerrin tracked down Ian at his house. The teenager had just woken up, but McFerrin noted that Ian was not surprised to see him. Ian said that everyone on the island had been talking about Laurie's murder. McFerrin followed Ian into his kitchen and sat at the small round table. Ian poured 2 cups of coffee, handed one to McFerrin, and sat down across from him. Ian said that he had seen Rochelle after she and her dad had searched for Laurie around town. Ian said he hadn't known anything about Laurie's disappearance, but he'd gotten worried about Rochelle because she wasn't answering her phone, and so that night he'd just gone over to her house to check on her. But right after saying this, Ian immediately jumped up from the table and rushed over to get sugar for their coffee. And to McFerrin, it seemed like Ian was really nervous. But McFerrin knew that people often got nervous when they were being questioned by the police, even if they didn't do anything. McFerrin thanked Ian for the sugar when he returned, and then McFerrin sipped his coffee and kept his tone casual. He was watching for signs that Ian was hiding something. He asked Ian about his history with Rochelle, and Ian blushed a bit, but then he said that yes, he had dated Rochelle for a while, but they had broken up a year earlier. However, they had remained close friends. McFerrin asked Ian about the 2 older guys, Jason and Brian, who also hung out with him and Rochelle. Ian told McFerrin that he and Rochelle were both very good friends with the other 2 guys. Brian owned the shop where they often played video games, and his buddy Jason often joined in. Ian also admitted to McFerrin that Rochelle's other teenage friends did not really hang out with her when Jason and Brian were around. Ian thought Jason rubbed the girls the wrong way. McFerrin had met Jason briefly. Jason had been with Rochelle when investigators had gone to their house. But now McFerrin really wanted to talk to Jason again to see why this young man might rub the girls the wrong way. At noon the same day, McFerrin met with Jason at the trooper post near the high school where Jason worked. McFerrin brought Jason into an interview room and offered him some water. Jason nodded and took the bottle from him, but left it on the table unopened. Jason, a big man nicknamed Red for the color of his hair, had once dreamed of becoming a Marine, but he had washed out of boot camp, mainly because he was seriously out of shape. So Jason came back to the small town of Craig, got a job as a high school janitor, and moved into his mother's basement. He also began hanging out at his buddy Brian's computer shop. As Jason and McFerrin talked, Jason spoke slowly and very carefully. He said he had previously dated Rochelle, something Rochelle never mentioned in her discussion with McFerrin. That was pretty strange, McFerrin thought. But Jason said that their romance did not last long because it caused way too much trouble for Rochelle at home. McFerrin couldn't be sure if Jason was telling the truth about dating Rochelle or if that was just male bluster, but Jason's claim did suggest that he was well aware that Laurie disapproved of him hanging around with her daughter. And McFerrin started to wonder if maybe Jason had wanted to get rid of Laurie because she got in the way of his relationship with Rochelle. McFerrin asked Jason what he was up to on the night of the murder, and he would say that he had been with his friend Brian at his place playing video games. They'd both been drinking, so Jason said he had just crashed there overnight. Eventually, the interview ended, and McFerrin let Jason go home for the day, but McFerrin still had a lot of unanswered questions about this young man. But as it would turn out, McFerrin would not have to wait very long to talk to Jason again. A few hours later, at 5:30 in the afternoon, Trooper Claus was sitting at his desk when his phone rang. Claus answered, and he heard a frantic voice on the other line. It was Jason, and Claus could barely understand what he was saying. Claus told Jason to take a breath and then asked what was going on. Jason shouted into the phone that he was at the school where he worked and he'd just been attacked by a man with a knife. Claus hung up the phone and immediately told McFerrin about the call. The 2 investigators raced over to the school, and when they arrived, they found Jason sitting on the bleachers by the football field. He was in tears as he told them that a man had snuck up on him by the dumpsters and held a knife to his neck. Jason said the man had warned him to stay away from Rochelle, or there was going to be another accident. Then the man ran the knife across Jason's neck. Jason showed the investigators a red mark that the serrated blade had left on his skin. Claus and McFerrin exchanged looks that expressed their doubts. They had been suspicious of Jason before because of his hidden romance with Rochelle, but his conduct now just seemed bizarre. He had no witness to back up his story, and the wound on his neck looked totally superficial and was likely self-inflicted. So the investigators wondered if this was a misguided attempt to distract them by introducing a new mystery suspect. McFerrin quickly pressed Jason for a description of his attacker. Jason claimed he didn't get a good look at the man, but McFerrin said that seemed highly unlikely. The attack happened in broad daylight. Surely Jason would have seen something that could help them identify the assailant. Jason's voice got softer as he tried to grasp for details. He was fumbling, which meant he was vulnerable. So McFerrin dropped any pretense that he believed what Jason was saying. He told Jason flat out that he thought he was lying. Jason looked like he had just gotten the wind knocked out of him. He was quiet for several seconds, then he let out a deep sigh and admitted that it was true. No one had attacked him. He had cut himself. Now, McFerrin knew he had the advantage. So he narrowed his eyes, stepped a bit closer to Jason to kind of intimidate him, and he told Jason that he thought he was also lying about another story he had told police. The one Jason had told police about what he was doing on the night Lori Waterman was killed. Jason started stuttering and said he really wasn't lying about that, but his face was flushed and he was sweating and talking in circles. The experienced investigators could see Jason's facade was starting to crumble. So McFerrin cut him off and said in a slow and certain tone that he knew Jason took part in Lori's murder. But now Jason's voice changed. He wasn't stuttering anymore. He spoke with urgency, like what he was saying was true and he needed them to believe it. He told the investigators that they really didn't understand. They did not know what Lori had done to deserve what happened to her. She was not this perfect person everyone thought she was. Then the big red-headed man looked right at McFerrin and he said he did not kill Lori, but he knew who did. Based on information provided by Jason and evidence discovered throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Lori Waterman on the evening of Saturday, November 13th, 2004. Not long after midnight, the killer stared at himself in the bathroom mirror. He picked up an electric razor from the counter, flipped it on, and methodically shaved off his bushy brown beard. When his face was clean-shaven, he brought the razor up to his head, and clumps of his floppy brown hair started falling into the sink. He knew from TV crime shows that a few strands of hair could give a killer away, so he wanted to make sure none of his hairs were left behind at the crime scene, hence why he was shaving them all off. A little before 1 a.m., the killer walked into his bedroom and grabbed a trash bag off the floor. Then he threw a bunch of supplies, including a roll of duct tape, a bristly old rope, and a bottle of wine, into that bag. With his break-in kit in hand, he stepped outside and got into his partner's idling pickup truck, and the two of them drove together to Lori's house. When they arrived, the killer picked his trash bag off the floorboard, got out of the truck, and closed the passenger door behind him. His partner sped away down the street. The killer looked at the big peach-colored house in the moonlight and reminded himself why he was doing this. A dangerous woman lived in that house, and she needed to be stopped. The killer pulled a pair of latex gloves from the trash bag, slipped them on, and then climbed into the two-car garage through a window. Once inside, he tried the door that led into the house, but it was locked. He tried to jimmy open the door with a butter knife that he'd brought along. He scratched up the striker plate on the lock, but he just couldn't get it to open. So he removed the cat door, crouched down, reached through the opening, stretched his arm out to unlock the door from the other side, and then let himself in. Once inside, the killer walked upstairs to the third floor and walked through an open door into the master bedroom where Lori was fast asleep. But the killer didn't do anything. Instead, the killer darted out of the bedroom, went back downstairs, and spent the next 2 hours pacing around the house while Lori slept upstairs, psyching himself up to go back up there and kill her. And finally, after 2 hours, at about 3 a.m., the killer was ready, so he grabbed his flashlight and other supplies from the trash bag and made his move. He went upstairs and burst into Lori's room and immediately enveloped her head with a t-shirt before she could even wake up. He put his massive weight on top of Lori, pinning her to the bed. Lori couldn't scream, she couldn't move, she couldn't do anything. Then the killer secured a cloth over her mouth with duct tape. The killer tied his rope around Lori's neck like a dog leash and dragged her from the bed across the room. He rifled through Lori's dresser, pulling out a sweater and jeans, and ordered her to change out of her nightgown. Lori complied with his demands, changing into street clothes right in front of him. The killer held the rope so she wouldn't go anywhere, but he averted his gaze. After Lori had changed, the killer wrapped socks around her wrists and then duct taped over them, sealing her wrists together. He didn't want to leave any residue from the tape on her skin, which is why he taped directly on the socks. The killer then forced Lori, who was now bound and gagged, down the stairs into her kitchen. And then once they were down there, he sat her down and took the gag from her mouth. He opened up the bottle of wine that he'd brought along, poured her a full glass, and forced her to drink it as he held it. He kept forcing Lori to drink wine until she'd finished the entire bottle. Then the killer put the gag back in Lori's mouth and led her out to the garage. He opened the back door of her purple minivan and ordered her to lie down across the back seat. Lori was now very drunk, but the killer was still worried about her making a run for it, so he tied her to an armrest and back to make sure she couldn't go anywhere. But after doing this, the killer noticed that the tip of his latex glove had ripped off while he was securing Lori with duct tape. Worried that he might leave a trace of his DNA in this tip of the glove, he ran back inside and back upstairs and scoured the bedroom, but he could never find that piece of latex. Cursing, he rushed back down to the garage. It was now close to 4 a.m., which meant he did not have much time until dawn. So he hopped behind the wheel of the minivan, and using Lori's keys, he turned it on and drove off, with Lori in the back, lying across the back seat, her arms and legs bound. As the killer drove out of town in the minivan, his partner caught up with him and followed in the truck they'd driven to the house. The killer drove about half an hour north of town, where the roads turned to gravel, and then he continued for another 30 minutes through the thick hillsides of Prince of Wales Island. Finally, he pulled over by a creek and pulled Lori out of the car. As for his partner, he parked his truck not far behind them. The killer then put a garbage bag on the ground and laid Lori on top of it to keep her from getting dirty. Getting dirt on Lori's clothes was not part of the plan because he wanted it to look like Lori had had a drunk driving accident. And so, with Lori in place on the trash bag on the ground, the killer crouched over Lori, wrapped his massive hands around her neck, and attempted to break it. He heard a crack, but Lori didn't die. Instead, her gag had slipped off. Lori, breathless and drunk, tried to say something to the killer, and the killer was horrified at the sound of Lori's voice. So he just raised his flashlight over his head and swung it as hard as he could against Lori's neck 12 times, but Lori just kept on breathing. Desperate to finish the job and just get out of there, the killer pinched Lori's nose and covered her mouth with the cloth, suffocating her. Lori struggled as best as she could to get free, but she was bound and gagged and totally intoxicated, and she was way smaller than the killer, and so she was no match. Lori's breath finally gave out, and she died laying on the ground in the middle of nowhere. The killer checked Lori's wrist for a pulse, and when he couldn't find one, he concluded that she was dead. However, after he cut off the tape around Lori's wrists and ankles, he could see there were clear marks on her neck, and there was mud on her clothes despite his efforts to keep mud off of them, and so this made him rethink his plan. He knew this would not look like a drunk driving accident. So, at 5 a.m., the killer put Lori's body back in the purple minivan and pushed the vehicle off the logging road down a steep embankment. It crashed into a fallen tree and came to a stop. The killer's partner had not planned for any of this, but he knew the plan was changing. The killer now wanted to destroy all the evidence. So, the partner grabbed a jerry can of gasoline from the truck and rushed over to the killer. The killer then poured that gasoline on the ground, on Lori's body, and all over the minivan. Then he backed away, lit a match, and tossed it onto the gasoline trail leading to the minivan. In 30 seconds, the vehicle had exploded with flames, but there was nobody around to hear it or see it except the killer and the partner. The killer and his partner ran back to the truck, and the two of them drove into town just before the sun started to rise. Once the killer got back to his place, He played some video games and tried to calm down, while his red-haired partner got ready for his janitor shift at the high school. And before he headed to work, he got a phone call from Lori's daughter, Rochelle, and she wanted to know how everything had gone earlier that morning. Jason, who had told police he did not kill Lori, was technically telling the truth. However, he was the partner who drove the truck and helped plan the murder. His friend Brian, who was also friends with Rochelle, had been the one who actually carried out the murder. However, these two were not acting alone. It turned out Rochelle had had sex with both Jason and Brian, and as a result, both of them would do anything for her. For months, Rochelle had complained to them about her mother. Over pizza and video games, she would tell them how Lori hated the way she dressed and took offense at Rochelle's adoption of Wicca, the nature-based religion associated with witchcraft. But most of all, Rochelle would tell them that her mother was really upset about her, Rochelle, hanging out with Jason and Brian. Her mother was afraid that Rochelle could marry someone like them, leading to a dead-end life instead of realizing her true potential. But Rochelle also critically told Jason and Brian that her mother physically abused her, slapping her and even hitting her with a baseball bat. She said her mother also threatened to sell Rochelle into prostitution. But none of Rochelle's stories of abuse were real. They were dark fantasies fueled by real-life mother-daughter friction. However, when she spoke to Jason and Brian about her mother, Lori was made out to be a real-life monster who was going to kill Rochelle unless Jason and Brian put a stop to it. So when Rochelle told Jason and Brian that she and her father would be away the weekend of November 13th, and her mother would be home alone, they knew what they had to do. Investigators had suspected both young men, but it was Jason's bizarre claim that he had been attacked by a stranger with a knife that sealed his and Brian's fate. McFerrin and Claus knew Jason was lying about that knife attack, but they also believed he was lying when he said he did not kill Lori. And so they pressed him, and he would finally admit to helping plan the murder and to driving Brian to the scene. So, in exchange for a lesser sentence, investigators got Jason to wear a wire and record Brian talking about the murder. And sure enough, on this wiretap, investigators would hear Brian describe basically everything that happened and who played a role, and so they had enough to arrest both young men and Rochelle. Brian was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 99 years in jail. Jason pled guilty and got a 50-year sentence for his role in planning the murder. As for Rochelle, she actually pled innocent, insisting that she told Jason to stop Brian from going ahead with the plan, but either Jason never relayed the message to Brian, or Brian just ignored it. In 2011, Rochelle was found not guilty of murder, but was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide. The jury found that even though Rochelle did not take part in her mother's murder, she clearly knew what Jason and Brian were planning and did very little to stop them. Rochelle served 3 years in prison and was released in 2015. She moved to Florida, where she revived her My Crappy Life blog and continues to maintain it.
Oh, world with nothing but borrowed plans. Stayed up late talking about dreams we didn't quite understand. We ran on hope and cheap coffee, believed time was on our side. Didn't know growing up meant some parts of us stay behind. Funny how fast the years fly when you think you've got forever. Now I look back and wonder if we ever knew better. We were almost who we wanted to be, almost fearless, almost free. We were standing at the start of it all, with nowhere to fall. Yeah, we were young. Underneath the moonlit sky, your hand in mine as time flies by. Whispers of the night, soft and tender, promises of love, always and forever. Always and forever, you and I, through the storms under the sky. Hearts entwined, never to sever. Our love will last.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out the rest of our studio's podcasts: Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries,